think the biggest thing that I noticed after the abuse was I struggled quite badly with mental health issues. I had quite bad depression from the age of 17 to about 20, 22, 23. And I didn't really know, especially when I was 17 up until about 20, I didn't really know why I had these mental health issues. And I sort of eventually realised it's probably due to the fact that I'd been sexually abused between the ages of sort of 9 and 11, and I'd never spoken to anyone about it. And essentially, I'd kept it a secret for more or less 6, 7, 8 years. And I think it got to a point in my life where unless I spoke to somebody about the abuse, I was quite scared about what I might end up doing. So it was certainly a sort of last resort to talk to people about the abuse I suffered. But funnily enough, it then turned out to be probably the best thing I'd ever done. Talking to the first person was definitely the hardest thing. But I think once I started talking to more people, it got a lot easier going forward from there. I pictured it recently as in sort of looking at sort of hurdles, and it's talking to the first person was the biggest hurdle. That was always the hardest. But then the second one was sort of telling a few more of your friends, and then the third one for me was telling my family, and which was probably the hardest conversation to have. And then the fourth conversation then was with the police, and obviously then once you talk to the police, it becomes very real. But then it's also that's sort of the beginning. I found that was the beginning of the end for me. I needed to do that to get to where I am today at the end of the day. And yeah, every person I spoke to about it became easier to talk about, and I didn't the guilt and shame that I'd been feeling for 10 years kind of subsided after every conversation I had. With the guilt and shame, there was guilt coming from a lot of places. There was guilt of I didn't know how people were going to react when I told them. I didn't want to put people in this uncomfortable situation where they feel like they have to know what to say. And of course, they don't know what to say because no one really knows what to say unless you're trained in talking to people who've dealt with sexual abuse. But then it was also the guilt of them having to deal with it. Not only do they have to know what to say, they don't have to deal with it. So my parents, for example, how are my parents going to deal with the fact that whilst they thought I was being protected when I was younger, I was actually being abused? I don't think anyone can prepare you for that, really. It's just a conversation you've got to have. And 9 times out of 10, I can imagine at the end of that conversation, you're going to feel a lot better for having that conversation. But it's a very hard conversation to have. And I think for me, for some reason, the largest guilt I felt was the guilt for the person who had abused me. And I knew that I spoke to the police, and I got a phone call from the police, and they said, we're actually going to go and arrest the guy tomorrow morning. And I went from thinking I had about 2 or 3 weeks to sort of process what I just told the police to it being brought down to a matter of sort of 12 hours. And I had to know that at 6 o'clock the next morning, his life was going to change forever. He'll never live the same life that he lived. I can look back now and see that that's quite unreasonable for me to think that, because he did it to me. It's his fault that he's in that situation. But at the time, I really, really struggled with that. I think that was definitely the thing I struggled with the most throughout the entire process. But then I told the police, and we went to court, and the court proceedings sort of lasted about 2 years. And then by the end of the 2 years, you sort of realise that actually you're not in the wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. You were the victim of this, and they deserve the punishment they've got. And it was definitely the closure of the sort of court proceedings and speaking to people and lifting the burden of the secret that definitely sort of lifted the shame and the guilt for me. Obviously it's quite personal to me, but I was actually traveling Europe at the time. I was with my friend, and I think we were in Croatia, and I realized that I hadn't really been very happy before we went traveling, and I certainly wasn't happy now I was away traveling, and probably shouldn't have come traveling at all, because it was quite obvious that I was struggling quite badly with depression and severe anxiety. And there I am in a hostel in Croatia, and that's not really where you want to be when you're feeling like that. And I sort of sat outside, and I realised that the reason I keep having mental health problems, the reason I keep having, I don't like the word relapse, but kept falling into these mental health issues every sort of year or so, it probably stemmed from the fact that I was abused when I was a child and I'd never really told anyone. And it was, for me, I always told myself that I might be able to talk to my friends about it. And like the friend I was traveling with knew, but I'd never tell the police. I'd never tell my parents because they just didn't need to know. It was my secret and I'd sort of leave it as that. And when I was sat in Croatia, kind of realized I had this sort of epiphany that actually I don't really think I'm ever going to get over these mental health issues I'm suffering with unless I have that conversation with my parents, unless I have that conversation with the police and it actually gets resolved. Yeah, obviously it's, to this day, probably the hardest conversation I've had was with my stepdad, sat on the steps of the hostel in Croatia, trying to explain to him over the phone that I was abused as a 9-year-old boy and he had no idea. And I was going to have to come home and tell my mum and tell the police. And yeah, I don't think anyone who's been in that situation enjoys that conversation. It's not a fun time, and for me was certainly the biggest struggle I had was a few days after that, having to deal with this secret you've kept for so many years, and you're never going to tell your parents because you don't want them to know, and then suddenly they know, and there's sort of no closing that door once it's opened. It's open then, and then again, fast forward a couple of weeks, and this feeling that I'd felt for 10 years of this burden I'd had just gone. Without sounding a bit cheesy, that was the start of my adult life in a way. That was, I could finally sort of get past all this worry I'd had for 10 years. So yeah, it was definitely mental health issues that I'd been suffering with. It was the catalyst talking about it. I think the biggest thing for me was I was so worried about what they would say because I said nobody has been trained, unless you have been specifically trained to know what to say when someone has been abused and they tell you, no one knows what to say, especially when it's one of your friends. They try and say the right thing, but 9 times out of 10 they're not going to say the right thing. But it was more, I knew that they wanted to say the right thing. I knew they were trying to say the right thing, and it was almost just the sort of the silence and the shock that it sort of made me realize that, hang on a sec, this is a big deal and I'm not in the wrong here. And I think it was quite strange for me how I've never really felt anger towards my abuser. I've never felt, I think I might have dealt with that when I was a lot younger. So by the time I became an adult and started talking about this, that had all sort of gone. And I started telling people and they became angry. And I'm sort of like, well, I'm not angry, so you don't need to be angry. This is how it is. But yeah, I don't think anyone I spoke to reacted badly. They didn't judge me, which was quite surprising. I think I judged myself for so many years. I told myself that it was my fault that I was in this situation. I should have spoken about it 10 years ago and it's too late to talk about it now. And then I started talking about it and there was never any sort of element of judge. That was quite a big surprise for me. It certainly made me question why I felt like I felt guilty. It sort of made me realize I shouldn't feel guilty for this in the slightest. It's talking about it. I struggle, especially as a man, and I'm not saying it's any worse for either men or women or anyone, but it's especially as a man, you do struggle to talk about your feelings and you struggle to talk about your mental health, and then to add on top of that, to talk about the fact that you were victimized and sexually abused as a child, it sort of makes you feel really emasculated. So talking about it's extremely difficult to do. I struggle so hard to talk, so badly to try and talk about it, but I can't explain the feeling of the sort of the sense of relief, immediate relief you feel when you actually start talking about it. And then sort of fast forward 5-6 years since I spoke about it for the first time now, and I think I used to spend I spent pretty much all of my teenage years trying not to think about it. But you can't help it. You think about it every day. That's just how it is. You try not to think about it. And as soon as you do think about it, you shut it down straight away. And now probably a day doesn't go past where I don't actively think about the abuse. I often think about where the abuser is or how my friends think about it, but it's not negatively. It's always, I try and I'll go on a walk. I love walking up mountains, and I'll keep the headphones out and I'll think about what happened when I was younger. And I'll try and rewrite the narratives. Instead of thinking about it from my own perspective, I can try and see everyone's perspective at the time. And I try and rewrite those 2 or 3 years of my life where I was being abused, and thinking about all the good things that happened at the same time, and how happy I was with my family, and how good my friends were when I was that age. And it's, instead of thinking about these 3 years and have this big black mark above them and say, well, don't think about those 3 years because that's always going to be negative, actually to actively think about those 3 years and put yourself in the position of being that young lad again. And for me especially, it did wonders for me to actually, I don't know, recovery is not quite the right word, but I guess it really helped me on my journey. Yeah. When I was at school, a lot of my friends were quite laddie, let's say, and I didn't really fit in with them. And it was quite obvious looking back now, as a teenager, I sort of suffered very badly with anxiety, and that anxiety stemmed from the abuse. And I look back now, and before I actively spoke about my abuse, it did affect my relationships quite negatively. I definitely felt like I was the one person in the friendship or the relationship that was harboring a secret, and I was sort of lying to people about who I was because there was a secret. And I think at school, everyone has secrets, but they're always silly secrets, like, oh, one of your friends fancies someone else, or like something like that. And whereas I was there and I was like, I have a genuine secret. I was sexually abused for 3 years. And a lot of my friends who I was friends with in high school, especially, a few of them were there. A few of them were sometimes in the same house when it happened. I struggle with those relationships, especially when it came to relationships with girls. I was always so anxious, and I didn't. And then I got to a certain age where I think I was lucky enough at university to have a group of friends that I knew wouldn't judge me. And I'm not saying my friends when I was a teenager would have judged me. It was more that I don't think they were mature enough, understandably at 15, to be able to deal with one of their closest friends telling them they were sexually abused, and there was a chance that you were in the same house when it was happening. I don't think anyone at 15 can deal with that. So I certainly wish I'd spoken about it sooner, because I think there's a lot of relationships I had, especially in my teenage years or early 20s, that certainly would have benefited me being confident enough to talk about it. Certainly in the long run, it helps me massively. It's this relationship you have with people, and then you feel like you're lying to them when they don't know the whole story of your life. And I don't go out and tell everyone on the street about what happened to me, but certainly if I've known someone long enough and I feel comfortable enough, I'll have that conversation with them, and chances are there's something happened in their life, and they want someone to talk to about that. And it's because you've been through something quite traumatic in a way, you find yourself being able to talk to people about these things that they might not be able to talk to with anyone else. And it's certainly been good for me in the long run, I would say. I've always been really close to my mum and my stepdad. My dad left when I was similar at the same time as being abused, unfortunately. But then I was so lucky to have my mum and my stepdad, and who are like two of my best friends. And it was, I think, that they say, I told myself from the age of 11 that they'd never know what happened to me. They'll never know. So when you tell them, you say you're opening this door that you're never going to be able to close again, and you're worried that they're not going to judge you, but you're worried they're going to judge themselves. And I think that's the thing I've definitely struggled with the most now. I think all the guilt I've had to deal with in my life about feeling like it's my fault, and I felt guilty for him going to prison. I've dealt with that, and I can get through that. But I'm still learning to deal with today is the guilt of knowing that my mum has to deal with it. My mum she'll always be asking herself what else she could have done. And I know that there's nothing she could have done, because it was so well hidden, it was so clever of the abuser that she would have never found out. But I know she'll feel guilty because she's a mum, and that's what mums do. But it's funny how me and my mum are closer than we've ever been after this. We were never drifted apart, but I think at university I distanced myself a lot with where I grew up. I distanced myself with the friends I grew up with, and I kind of distanced myself from my family. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to go home and relive all of that. And then I told my mum, and it was kind of the catalyst for us becoming really close again. And especially with my stepdad as well. It's like we're close. I can talk to my mum about anything. After telling your mum that you were sexually abused, I don't think there's really anything you could tell your mum that's going to shock her in a way. So it's that relationship becomes so strong. And again, it was the same with my stepdad, really. I first went to the doctors when I was 17, struggling with depression. Again, I kind of probably knew at the time the reason I felt depressed was because I was sexually abused. I didn't tell the doctors. I couldn't tell them. I didn't feel ready to tell them. And it was only after the depression and the anxiety had come back maybe 2 or 3 times, and it had gotten to a point where it was looking quite bad, let's say. And that was the sort of the catalyst for me. And again, I think that was certainly the catalyst for me to say, right, I need to sort this out now. And then again, I told the police, I told my family, and the police then put me in touch with the Survivors Trust, and I had 10 or 12 weeks of counselling. And out of everything in my journey, that's the thing that probably helped me the most. It wasn't so much. I can only remember maybe 2 or 3 counselling sessions out of the 12 or the 10 that we spoke about the abuse. It was more having someone there who was there to talk to you, completely talk to you for an hour every week. And you could talk to them about anything. You were talking about your relationships, your friendships, your work, your university course. And then occasionally we talk about the abuse. And then the relationship you formed with the relationship I formed with my therapist was probably at the time the strongest relationship I had with anyone. It was incredible. I think perhaps that was the right time for me to have therapy. Maybe if I had it before, I wouldn't have appreciated it as much. And maybe if I'd left it any longer, it would have been too late. But I think in hindsight, I probably should have spoken to the doctors when I was 17. I think my life would have been the end of my teenage years and my early 20s would have been very, very different if I'd had that conversation 4 years earlier. But again, I didn't, and as long in my head, as long as I've had that conversation, which I have now, I'm proud of myself for having that conversation with a therapist. It took me 12 years to have the conversation, but it's been had now, and I'm a better person for it. If you want to talk to someone who you think might have suffered, or someone's actively telling you that they've suffered, I think it's just listening. It's purely just having, unless you've been through it yourself, you're probably not going to understand what they're going through. But the fact that they're talking to you just means that they need someone to talk to, and that's fine. I don't think you have to know the answers to the questions. When I first told my stepdad, I spoke to him on the phone in Croatia, and he sort of asked yes and no questions. And he was like, did something happen when you were younger? And I said, yes. Was it someone in the family? No. Were you sexually assaulted? Yes. Was it by so-and-so? Yes. And it was, again, I can't remember the questions he asked, but it was just the way he asked it. And it was a weird, I'd never heard him speak like that in my life. And it was like he knew at the time how serious it was without telling me he knew it was serious. It was a bizarre conversation, but I'll never forget it. And he didn't know what to say. He was at the time he was late 30s. He just listened, and I sat on the phone and I had that conversation, and that was all I needed at that time. That's all I needed. And I think if you're the person who is struggling to talk to someone, I think luckily enough for me, I had a great family and I had a great set of friends that I could rely on. But I soon realised the detective in my court case was probably one of the most useful people I had in my phone book. I could talk to her about anything. And my counsellor was, as I said, it was the hour therapy sessions I had every week were the best hours of my week. I could talk to her about anything. So yes, I was incredibly lucky to have such a good support network, but there are so many people out there that will listen to you and will want to have that conversation. And I think that's something that I wish I had known when I was 15 or 16 or even 20. I wish I'd known that there were that many people that would have had that conversation with me had I asked.